Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones, and I'm excited to be moving ahead through the Gospel of Mark with everyone in this translation notes webinar, Mark 12, 18 through 27, part 2. And thank you, too, for your patience and flexibility as we had to do a little bit of a different time this week just to accommodate some schedule variations that I had. So we're at a different time today. Of course, we're recording today's webinar, so there may be folks who signed up who will be watching it later. If you are here live in the GoToWebinar control panel, there is a handout section where you can access this PDF that you're seeing on my screen. You can also get it at the URL shown here, tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes. And you can email me at abramkj@accordancebible.com. That's true for all of you here live, and if you're watching on a recording, you can email me as well, and also access the handout in this way. The focus of this ongoing session really is on the lexical questions that come up when we translate and the grammatical questions that come up. Those are the two focuses. I won't say more about that because I think by now folks who have attended these webinars will expect that approach. We are, of course, in accordance the whole time, but this is not a feature-focused webinar per se. It is very much kind of live. How do we actually use accordance to accomplish this task, specifically translating from Greek to English? So please make use of the questions box. As you have questions, you can type in a question or comment there at any time, and we'll stop from time to time and check in on there. If someone could just confirm, or if you can hear me and see me okay, just let me know in the questions box and the handout. Just confirmation would be great. I'm assuming it's all good. It's good from my end. Make sure we're good with you. All right, well, let's review the passage from last week. Great, thanks for the confirmation. Mark 12, 18 through 23 is about how far we got, and we didn't do a whole lot on verses 22 and 23. So we will look at those again today. But let's ramp up with the very beginning. Now some Sadducees came to him, those who say, or the ones who say there is no resurrection. And they asked him, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother should die and should leave a wife, but should not leave a child. Remember, we talked about this is probably a little clunky to leave a translation this way, but I wanted to bring out this is the subjunctive, it's this hypothetical situation. Then his brother should marry the wife and should raise up children for his brother. That's the kind of common ground they're establishing. Appeal to Moses. And then they lay out the scenario. There were 7 brothers, and the first married a woman, and before he died, did not leave any children. Then the second brother married her and died, leaving no children. Then the third brother in the same way, and all 7 did not leave children. Last of all, the woman also died. Now here's kind of what they're leading up to. In the resurrection, when they rise again, of which of them will she be the wife? For all 7 of them had had her as a wife. All right, let's go back at, we're just gonna look at verse 22 and 23 to get maybe kind of warmed up for the rest today. And we briefly looked at these last time. I've filled this out just a little bit more for us to engage with today. But in verse 22, I'll go to accordance for this, and we'll read 22 and 23 together. So we've got Kai hoi hepta uk aphekan sperma, and the 7 did not leave offspring or seed, or children, if you want to translate it that way. We talked a little bit last week about how this is in the singular. So offspring is also in the singular, but it is talking about a collective. I mean, it didn't leave any is the point. It was not, there were no descendants. Eschaton panton kai hegune apethanen. Last of all, also the woman died. Ente anastase, in the resurrection, hatan anastosin, when they rise, This is in brackets in the NA28 because it's a textual question. We'll talk about that in a minute. Tinas auton estai gune. Of whom, genitive, or whose of them is or will be the woman. So in other words, whose wife will she be? Hoi gar hepta eskan autain gunaika. For the 7 had her as a wife. You've got here, I don't think I noted this in the handout, but you've got a double accusative. They had her, or they had been married to her, if you want. Autain, accusative, gunaika, accusative. They had her as a wife or for a wife. They were married to her, if you want to smooth that out. But the point is this scenario where, again, as I say, they've established some common ground with this appeal to Moses. They've appealed to a shared authority, not just authority, but a shared authority. And they've given a scenario, and now they've asked this question. So let's look at these verses a little bit more. We, like I said, kind of started in on these last time. It starts with this, and all 7 did not leave children. And really, as we go left to right, we saw it reads like, and the 7 did not leave offspring. And you could translate it that way and leave it that way. But they've already mentioned the first, second, and third brothers. And the only reason that we don't have them saying, and the 4th and the 5th, because they don't need to. The 3rd died, and so on and so forth, or et cetera, et cetera. The actual wording is, the 3rd brother in the same way. And so kind of there's an ellipsis here. Really what is implied is that none of the 7 left children. It just says the 7 did not leave offspring. But I think kind of connecting the dots a little bit, or making this narrative thread flow a little more smoothly, I would not translate it as, and the 7 did not leave offspring. It's something a little bit more like, and out of all 7 of them, none of them left offspring. Or, if you want to be a little bit more paraphrasing, and they kept on dying, but no offspring. Or something like, none of the rest of them left offspring either. So you might just think about that, how you translate it. I always, at least initially, go with a pretty wooden left to right translation as much as I can. Sometimes word order variation between the languages will not permit that. But then I also want to read it through just for readability, and with the question of what's the author doing, what's the narrative doing, what's the text doing. And here I think this implication is important to bring out in translation somehow, however you decide to do it. I like what the NIV does here, and I think I mentioned this last time. They bring out the force of what the Sadducees are saying, which is, in fact, Jesus, none of the 7 left any children. Now, the Greek word for none is not in here. In fact is not in there unless you consider kai to translate as in fact. So this is a little bit more, it's not even paraphrasing, but it's not as kind of word for word. But it very much kind of brings out the rhetorical effect of what this would sound like after they had said brother 1, brother 2, brother 3. So I'll stop there. If you've got comments or questions on that, let me know. But the point is, all 7, hoi hepta, died and left no children. And if you want to just not tinker with this too much, or not think about it too much, I would just, instead of saying and the 7, you could just say, and all 7 did not leave children. But I like the NIV here because it brings out kind of the flavor of how this comment would read in its context. So then in verse 23, we've got them asking in the resurrection, when they rise again, of which of them will she be the wife? For all 7, same thing there, hoi hepta, the 7, all 7 of them had her as a wife. Now, brackets can be used a couple different ways. When I'm using them in these webinars and in my translation, most of the time I'm using them to show where a word per se may not be in Greek. So for example, this is 21 is a good example. Then the 2nd married her and died, then the 3rd in the same way. That's what the Greek says. They don't use the Greek word for brother there. However, I think that makes for a more intelligible English translation. So I'll put that in brackets sometimes just to kind of show the correspondence. If you see brackets in a Greek text like this, though, that means there's a textual issue and that they are not certain enough about, what's the best manuscript, what's the best reading. They're not certain enough to like put it in or take it out, or they just do brackets to show you that, we think this probably belongs here, but we're not 100% sure because some of these things you just can't be sure about. So that's what that's about. And so when I'm translating, I'll often just leave it in brackets like that. Some good resources for this kind of thing would be even just starting with the NET Bible, which almost every textual issue they'll have a comment on. And so you can just hovering over, let me get to the right verse here. 49 is the footnote for verse 23, so you can click and hold or just hover, see it in the instant details. And it talks about which manuscript witnesses have this and which don't, how the variation might have arisen, what they think is the best read of what the original Mark manuscript might have, or the earliest manuscripts, or however you want to think about it. So that may be as much as you want to do on what's called text criticism. There certainly are many more resources that are available in accordance. And if you got a question or comment about that, let me know. We could go over that. But generally for translation, if I see brackets in the Greek, I'll just keep them there. So they ask, of which of them will she be the wife, which is much more elegantly expressed just as whose wife shall she be? And we're sort of left, whether you decide or that you think this is part of Mark's text or not, they're talking about the resurrection either way. That seems to be fairly well established in the text, in the resurrection when they rise again. And so we're back to this question that we started with last week, which is, why are the Sadducees, who Mark is clear to tell us don't believe in the resurrection, why are they saying in the resurrection? They have made this theoretical situation, and they're talking about, in theory, whose wife will she be? But this part in their scenario is not theoretical. They're saying in the resurrection as if like it's something that everyone believes is going to happen. And of course, the irony here is they don't believe it. So we might wonder about that, and maybe we don't have to wonder very long. Maybe it's just clear that they're just trying to catch Jesus, trying to trap him. They're not asking a curious question. They're not out to learn. They're not out to dialogue, to have true dialogue. Here's from the SIL Exegetical Summary Series, and it has a nice summary on this particular question. I put this in your handout. It just says, the Sadducees implied that when all of them had been resurrected, the woman would have 7 husbands at the same time, and thus violate the Mosaic law that required a woman to have only 1 husband at a time. Although a man might practice polygamy, a woman could not in the present life, and especially not in the resurrection. So this is kind of where it starts to quote other commentators. It was unthinkable that all 7 brothers could be her husbands at the same time in the present life, and even more implausible if there was a resurrection. So again, they're trying to catch Jesus in this. I thought maybe this is what's called a reductio ad absurdum, and I just put the definition of that from one of the resources we have in accordance. A standard way of refuting an argument, this dictionary says, by showing that if carried to its conclusion, it actually leads to an impossibility. So that's, I think, what they're trying to do. They're trying to say, well, look, if there is a resurrection, you got to have an answer for this. And since you don't have an answer, Jesus, therefore there's no resurrection. That may be where they're going with it. But regardless, we do know that this is a question that's just not coupled with genuine belief in the resurrection. And Mark has explicitly told us as much in verse 18. He defines the Sadducees as those who say there is no resurrection. So we're back now to a mention of resurrection, but Mark has tipped us off, although very likely Mark's original audience would have already known this. So this background information is great for us reading today. If it is redundant for the early readers, we might ask the question, why did he include that? And I think it's just to say, look, here's a ridiculous scenario, oh readers. Here are the Sadducees, the ones who don't believe in the resurrection. And then they ask this question, and it culminates in this question here, in the resurrection. So I will stop there. We're going to try to finish this passage today with 4 more verses. But let's see if that raises questions for you or comments. Is there anything that seems relevant to address there, especially as a question of translation, either in verse 23 or 24. I'll make this so you can see both of these at once. Maybe just take a moment and look over those verses and see if any questions come up before we move on. All right, well, let's keep going with verse 24. So we're going to get an answer now, and I'll go back to accordance for this. Ephi autois ha Jesus. Jesus said to them, U diatuta thanaste, is it not because of this that you are mistaken or deceived? Me edates, because you don't know, tas graphas, me de tendunamin tutheu, the writings or the power of God. And we've got a question mark there. So let's look at this in translation. Jesus said to them, isn't the reason you are mistaken that you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God? And I just noted here this u diatuta. Is it not because of this that you are mistaken? You could think about ways to smooth that translation out a little bit. You could, I wouldn't phrase it as a statement, but because he's asking a question, I think that's important to preserve. If you were to rephrase it as a statement, what he's saying is, you are mistaken because you don't know the scriptures and you don't know the power of God. But he's asking it as a question. So you could say, isn't why you are mistaken because you don't know, or isn't the reason that, maybe think about how to do that. You could even see different translations. But what do they not know? This edates, which comes from oida, we could even triple click that and see this word, which know is the translation equivalent you would learn in first semester Greek, to have information about. There can also be a connotation of kind of a more intimate intimately acquainted with, to grasp the meaning of something. I think that what we're seeing here is not just Jesus talking about head knowledge. I think he's saying you don't know, like you haven't experienced, like you don't, like you're not intimate with the scriptures and the power of God. And I don't know if you want to try to bring that out in translation. I mean, know in English, K-N-O-W, is already a pretty multivalent word, just like it is in Greek and in Hebrew. So maybe you just leave it that way and it kind of gets unpacked in a note or a conversation or your own notes or a Bible study or something like that. But I do just want to point out, I don't think I put this in the handout, this know here, you could read it at a very kind of basic level of they are not aware of the scriptures, like they don't have head knowledge of them or the power of God. But it's hard to believe that that's all that Jesus is saying, because they've literally just quoted the scriptures. So it's, it's not that they don't know them in their heads. I think especially with this mention of the power of God, I think this is a more it's still a head knowledge, but it's something that has gone deeper into something more experiential. So again, I just kept it as no in translation, and maybe that is the best way to do it. In fact, I'd be curious to see you can go to live click. I know this is a lot of time on one word, but this is actually kind of a key word for the passage. We'll go to verse lookup, and we'll click on 24. Make this bigger. Gonna go to modern text to just get English. So we get no. All I see is no so far. You know, you don't know, ye know not. No in 10 days. That's understand. Here's the NASB. You do not understand the scripture. So that's a little bit more than just you know, like learning something factually. There's something there that's a little bit more kind of like taking it in, processing it. I don't see anything that's explicitly bringing out this idea of intimacy, like intimate acquaintance. So again, my own translation, I've just done no, but I think if that's how you translate, I think some kind of note, or just even if you're just doing this for yourself, some kind of understanding that I think there's more than just head knowledge at stake here. And that's why they're mistaken, because they don't know the scriptures or the power of God. And let's unpack those two a little bit more. What don't they know? Well, it's tas graphos, the writings is what that word is. And let's go to BDAG for that. So if we triple click on the word, that will take me to my default Greek lexicon. And interestingly, you've got just this kind of generic definition, a brief piece of writing. So it could be literally any writing, like not necessarily sacred writing or holy writing or divinely inspired writing. It could be like a handwritten receipt or something like that. And you might even look at some of these references to see if you could find examples where it's more mundane or secular or whatever. But there's also this use of it as sacred scripture. And I appreciate this BDAG. I've put this this much in your handout. It says this can be an individual scripture passage if it's in the singular. So see this, let me make this a little bit bigger here. This is where BDAG is, it can be like surgically precise, but you got to slow down sometimes and tarry with the abbreviation. So what this is hey, that's just the singular feminine definite article. And that G period is the abbreviation for the word under consideration, which is graphe. So, hey, graphe, the scripture. So if this were in the singular, if it looked like this, then it would be referring to an individual scripture passage. And, you know, Jesus actually could have said that, which would have been interesting, because they do mention an individual scripture passage. We looked at that last time from Deuteronomy. But Jesus actually goes a step further than that, and he's under he's here in BDAG under 2b. Well, that's anachronistic. I mean, Jesus, you know, BDAG is obviously long after, but he's talking about scripture as a whole. And here is BDAG, the plural, hai graphi, and we've got that we've got in the accusative. So the hai graphi, that's just the nominative, but tas graphos, because it's the object of knowledge, it's in the accusative. Same thing. This plural graphi designates collectively all the parts of Scripture. And BDAG puts Mark 12:24 here, and you've got other references here where you can see that same thing happen. So what Jesus is doing, which is kind of interesting, and I don't know if this is deliberate or not, but he could have said, you don't understand the scripture passage, but he's going, by pluralizing it, he's going a little bit broader and saying they don't understand the scriptures as a whole. Now in English, I've translated this as the scriptures, but I also, and I just do this colloquially, if I'm talking to somebody about the Bible, I might say scripture says, that's in the singular. And so I suppose you could render it that way, but I do think it's nice to just preserve the plural in this case, especially because I think that might show an English reader that he's going from a scripture passage to the scriptures as a whole. Mark gives us two other uses of this word, and we could look at them by right-clicking, searching for lexeme, And we could just scroll down here. We've got Matthew, and of course we could read that, but here's Mark. We've got 12:10. Have you not read this scripture? So you've got tautein, but tein graphein, and that's a specific scripture. So that's that singular use. Here's 12:24. And then we'll get later on 14:49. This happened, but in order that might be fulfilled, the scriptures, high graphi, like the totality of the scriptures. And not even like, I don't think this plural scriptures means like 2 or 4 or 8 passages under consideration. There is a kind of totality to it. So this is pretty, implicating here. And then the power of God. If we had more time today, or perhaps on your own, you could look at this more, and this would be a word that I would want to look at and see what exactly that power is. How do you understand it? You've got here might, strength, force, capability. BDAG defines it as potential for functioning in some way. And if the question is, what is this power functioning for? Well, we're going to see we're talking about the resurrection. So this power has to do with the power that makes resurrection possible, the power that raises people from the dead. That's the particular power. And we have to kind of read on to get that for sure. But that's the particular power that's under consideration. You could even just do a search too, and I'll just show you this, and then maybe you're interested on your own. If you wanted to search for power of God, you could right-click and search for the lexeme. And we've got the parallel passage in Matthew. Here's something in Luke. The Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. That's really interesting. I would look at that, even though it's not Mark. And that might help you unpack this word. But I don't think the translation itself is very difficult. I think power is a pretty typical equivalent for dunamis. But even in English, the word power, like the word know, K-N-O-W, probably requires some unpacking at some point. So I think the most important consideration here is what kind of power, power for what, power to do what, power to activate what, and that gets defined by context, which here is the dead being raised. Jesus said to them, "Isn't the reason you are mistaken that you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God?" We will come back to this pretty important word of planaste. You'll notice here the NET has deceived and then says or mistaken. And those could very well be two different things. We'll come back to that because this word comes up again. I want to wait till we've kind of seen it again, and we'll look at that in passage. So maybe just we'll look at that in context, rather. So maybe just bookmark that. And in translation, I'm often doing this. I might even in my initial translation put mistaken / deceived, put it in bold, highlight it, underline it, whatever, and know, okay, I got to come back to that because I'm not really sure which way to translate it. Maybe the rest of the passage will help shed some light on that. I have a little bit more on this verse, but let me just stop there, and especially that piece about the scriptures and the power of God. I have more in the handout here, but let me stop and see what questions folks might have on anything so far. From the Zondervan exegetical commentary, it says Jesus's answer to the Pharisees and Herodians, this is a previous passage we had, about paying taxes to Caesar was clever and enigmatic. I mean, not that it wasn't understandable, but it was, more of a parable. This one to the Sadducees is explicit and corrective. That's a nice reminder and a good summary of what's going on in chapter 12. And yeah, I mean, this is about as explicit as you get. He's calling them mistaken or deceived. And he's saying why it is. And I mean, just imagine having this said to you and the impact it might have. And of course, Jesus doesn't need us to justify him, but this is very much matching their approach. So it's not like it's out of left field or anything like that. But still, I mean, this is a strong, powerful statement. And we do well to ask too, how is it that they are mistaken with regard to each? So Jesus says, isn't the reason you're mistaken that you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God? And you can imagine them very quickly say, what do you mean we don't know the scriptures? We literally just quoted scripture to you. And this piece about the power of God, that seems to kind of speak to the resurrection right away. So, but again, I can imagine them saying, well, we know plenty about the power of God. So the question then is, how are they mistaken with regard to each? The rest of the passage will unpack this a little bit more. And that's going to link us to verse 25. So we'll stop again for any questions or comments. But I think any reader ought to be asking this question: in what way are they mistaken? Hopefully the ideal Sadducee who is actually open to learning and dialogue, which these ones don't seem to be. But the hope would be that you say something like this as Jesus, and the other person is like, oh, okay, you think I'm mistaken? Like, in what way? Like, how do I think through this? And this gar right here is the hinge for that. Isn't the reason you were mistaken that you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God? For, in other words, I'm about to ground what I just said, namely that you're mistaken when it comes to not knowing the scriptures or the power of God. So we'll come back to that in just a minute, because we're going to look at 25, 26, and 27. But I will pause again and see, just make sure folks are tracking, or if you've got questions or comments on verse 24. I read, and I cannot remember what essay it was, but it was some theologian, whether you agree with this or think this is appropriate or not, I'll leave to you, but some theologian who was quoting another theologian and said something about that theologian not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God. And I just thought, wow, I was not expecting. I mean, I know, theologians can kind of go after each other, but it's like, whew, that was strong. Which just, again, made me realize as I read this passage today, like, yeah, those are very strong words that probably nobody wants to hear. But he's gonna defend them. Again, not that he has to, but in that situation, they sure think he does. So let's look at what comes next in verse 25. Jesus is gonna basically ground that claim and talk about the ways in which they're just missing both scripture and the power of God. Verse 25. Hatan gar ek nekron anastosin, ute gamusin, ute gamizantai. So let's just look at that. For when or whenever from the dead they rise, neither they marry, nor they are given in marriage. Alestin, hos angeloi, en tois uranois. But they are like angels in heaven. Here's my translation. For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but they are like angels in heaven. And this is back to this grounding. So verse 25, Strauss in his Zondervan commentary says, they are misled or mistaken concerning the power of God, because resurrection will be a new kind of immortal, glorified existence like that of the angels in heaven. And that's what we get here in verse 25. So who will rise from the dead? This anastosin, there's no pronoun or explicit subject here. Every Greek verb has kind of built into it a subject, anastosin, and so it's they, third person plural. In fact, you'll see this in many translations, including mine. You might ask the question, who is they, or who are they? And I think it's likely all people. I think Jesus is saying for when people rise from the dead, because I think he's making a broad kind of descriptive statement of the resurrection in general. Commentators suggest the impersonal they, which we have in English too, like, well, you know what they say, better a bird in hand than two in the bush. And, if somebody says that to you, you probably don't really say, well, who are they? or maybe you do if you want to question that conventional wisdom, which is never a bad idea. But the they in that sense is this impersonal, like what people say or somebody says, or what is said. So that's a possibility. Another possibility that commentators come on is given these two different verbs for marry, M-A-R-R-Y, that it could be talking about men and women almost as separate subjects. Gamusin from gameo and gamizantai from gamiso. So marry or given in marriage. Some commentators say that the one is men, the other is women. That would harken back to the 7 men and the 1 woman of the theoretical story, and presumably that's all inclusive of humanity. It could also be the they here could be pointing back to the 7 brothers and the widow. So in other words, and I would not put this in translation because I don't think it's clear, but you could understand this as, for when the 7 brothers and the widow rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage. I think at the end, it's best to render it as they in translation, because we don't get much more than that in Greek. But I also don't think it would be a bad idea to do something like, for when people rise from the dead, because that people is still generic. That's not that different from a third person impersonal plural. But maybe just spend a little bit of time thinking about that. But I do think it's at least worth, anytime you see a referent that it is not immediately clear, you're going to be asking, who is this, and how do I bring that out in translation? But in this case, I would just keep it as they rise. And in my understanding, I think this is a general statement, so I think that they is all people. There's some rich theology here, which, to kind of maintain our focus on translation per se, I won't go into unless there are comments or questions, which I'm happy to share. But it does raise the all-important question, with this word hos, that is not a word of identity or, A equals B. A scene would be that. So if it had just said, alesin angeloi entois uranos, that would mean, but they are angels in heaven. That's identity. Like think mathematically about identity, like A equals B. However, this hos here qualifies that and says they are like angels in heaven. And so implied in that is they are not angels in heaven per se. They are like angels in heaven. And every like has remaining from it an unlike. So there will be some ways in which they, which I think is all humanity here, will be unlike angels in heaven. That's not what the passage is saying, and so I won't even try to explore that in translation. I'll just bring out hos as like. But I also want to understand, as I'm translating, that this hos here makes this a very different statement from they are angels in heaven. It's just that they are like angels in heaven, not a one-to-one identity. And theologically, I think where this gets important, and I'll just only briefly touch on this, is that there is, I think, kind of some folkloric belief that when you die, you become an angel. And at least according to this verse, what we get is they are not angels in heaven per se. They are like angels in heaven. Of course, theologically, it was super interesting to ask, well, okay, what are the ways that we're like and what are the ways that we're not like? And Jesus is not answering that, except that this is about marriage. So what you could understand this to say, and you could, I mean, there's a whole theology of angels to be discovered, I think, throughout the scripture. I think this is saying one specific thing about angels in this verse, and that is that angels neither marry nor are given in marriage. And I'm getting that just from the context. So you could read this as, for when people rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but they are like angels in heaven, who neither marry nor are given in marriage. That's all that this verse is saying explicitly, I think, about angels, is that they are not married, and this is meant to be some kind of like familiar Like when you use the hos, when you say it's like this, you're explaining a lesser known concept by a better known concept. And so the idea here is that there's going to be some kind of common awareness of what angels are like. But again, I think it's just to drive home this point, marriage. So the expected effect on the audience is for the audience, and especially the Sadducees, to say, oh yeah, I know that angels are not understood to be married or given in marriage. So that's what he's referring to. Well, here's more about angels from the SIL Exegetical Summary Series. This is probably the key point here. In this context, like angels means that the risen dead will experience life with respect to sex and marriage in the same way that the heavenly angels do. So that actually, so I've been talking about marriage here in this verse, but it brings up sex here because of the connection specifically to offspring and progeny. So that is also at play, by the way. It's not kind of explicitly recapitulated in this verse, but the question was, not just about marriage, but about offspring and sort of that procreative result or hoped for result of marriage. So I actually think these commentators are right to bring that back in. Marriage will be a matter of the past. Some more commentators, life will be like that of the angels, where marriage will no longer exist as it does now. One commentary is quick to point out, this does not mean that the Christians will be deprived of any meaningful relationships with believing family members and friends. And, talk about theology. I mean, there's a lot here, not just about angels, but this whole thing about, will we be married in heaven? The answer this verse gives is no. Of course, there's interpretation to do and contextualization, and you might even wonder how universal of a statement about humanity is Jesus making here. That's open to interpretation, which I think needs to be backed up. But at the least, you can translate it and then kind of go from there, decide where you want to go theologically with this. I think in translation in real life, for me, if I'm trying to make my way through a text, I want to balance translating it well and continuing on through a book or a chapter. But I also get really curious about this stuff, and I think it's super important. So this is probably a great place to do a detour, maybe using something like your research search in accordance. So you might even just go to your dictionaries and type in angel. And of course, you could keyword search that too. You don't need your dictionaries for that. You could we'll come back to that research search in a minute, but you could search for the lexeme, and you've got 175 uses here in the New Testament. So you could look at angels in the New Testament, but you've also got some great dictionary articles in your library. Probably, even if you've just got a couple dictionaries, they'll have something on this, including the nature of angels. So that will be helpful, and surely this passage will be mentioned somewhere. Here it is, that Jesus answered the Sadducees' objection to the idea of resurrection. You could do the same thing with marriage. Maybe you're wondering about marriage in heaven. You could do the same thing with heaven. So this raises a lot of key questions that people have been asking for a long time, but none of that has to be resolved for you to be able to make this translation. And just noting too that hos, it's right there. You won't miss it as being the word like in translation, but that is kind of a key point to make sure to preserve, that they are not angels in heaven, but they're like angels in heaven, specifically in this verse with reference to marriage, overall in the passage with reference to progeny or offspring, or kind of transmitting the family name or something like that. All right, I'll stop there. That was a lot for one verse. I hope that gives you some helpful directions you might go and research on this verse if you're interested in that. For me, certainly I am. Raises really interesting theological questions that come up quite often in Bible studies, even if we're not on this passage. They'll come up anyway. So maybe good to do some research on that. Any comments or questions on verse 25? Let's go to verse 26 then. So Jesus is, he's still, remember this kind of overriding statement, they're mistaken or deceived with regard to the scriptures and the power of God. And verse 26 kind of continues this. Now he talks about the dead being raised, so there's the power of God. And now he goes to the book of Moses. So there are the scriptures again. And Moses has been mentioned in this passage. So he's appealing to a common authority just like they are. Only he's telling them they don't really know that common authority like they think they do. Peride ton necron, but about the dead, hati agerantai, about the dead, the fact that they are raised. And here, who's raised? There's no question. The subject is the dead. Up anegnote ente biblo Mouseos. Have you not read in the book of Moses, Epitubatu, about the bush, Pos epenauto, hatheos legon, how God said to him, saying, or just quotation marks, Ego hatheos Abraham, I am the God of Abram, Kai hatheos Isaac, and the God of Isaac, Kai hatheos Jacob, and the God of Jacob. I've rendered it this way, but regarding the dead, the fact that they are raised, have you not read in the book of Moses about the burning bush, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. You'll notice my notes on this verse are more fragmentary, and I've just pointed out two things here, although there's quite a lot here that you might research. One is Epen auto hatheas legon, and God said to him, comma quote. And we've talked about this before. It's worth repeating. You've got two saying verbs, so that a literal word for word translation would be said to him, God, saying, but in English we just use quotation marks. So that's what I put there. This is Exodus 3:6. You'll find this in just about any translation or commentary. It will point you to that. You could also look at this in the Septuagint of Exodus, but again, it's that shared common, pardon the typo there, it's that shared common ground of this scripture of Moses. Now, notice he says here, and this is not in your handout, but the book of Moses. Before, they had just said Moses wrote for us, but it's the same Moses. It's just a different way of referring to it. You might get curious about this phrase here. Do we have the book of Moses anywhere else? It looks like it's only here. I wonder if I get rid of that article. Yep, that's just here. This would be good to check some of your more Greek-oriented commentaries on and see if they say anything. France is a good one here, specifically about naming it the Book of Moses. The source of the quoted text is unusually specifically identified not only by book, but also by section, epitubatu, about the bush. So if France is reading in the passage about the bush, I mean, that's, Jesus is not giving chapter and verse. It's a little anachronistic to talk in that way, but he's being very specific about the passage. They all know where he's talking about. But France just says that in the book of Moses denotes probably the Pentateuch as a whole, rather than merely the book of Exodus, in which Moses' story is primarily told. And that would be an interesting point. Maybe that is of interest to you, maybe it's not, but I would check some other commentaries too and see what they say about that. It is just that there is no other use of Book of Moses, at least that I was finding with that search in the New Testament. So we don't have other things to refer to, but your commentaries ought to help you here and maybe even point you in a certain direction. I would think that the SIL Exegetical Summary Series might have something here on the Book of Moses. Here it is. It means the book that Moses wrote, the Pentateuch. So there you go. So I think that's a pretty, seems to be a shared interpretation that folks have. That wasn't a whole lot on that verse, but I'll stop there anyway and see if you've got questions or comments, or in particular, if there's anything about that verse in the translation that I didn't address that you'd like to know about. You'll notice here I put burning bush in brackets because that word burning is not in the text. I just think in English, of course, the NET disagrees with me. And it is a little bit more literal to just say in the passage about the bush. In English, I think generally speaking, in scripturally literate context where we're talking about Exodus 3, burning bush is a much more common way that I've heard talk about it. So I think that might make sense for modern readers. But again, that's not exactly what Jesus said. It is the burning bush, but you can decide what you want to do with that. That is a question really of translation and target audience and what's going to make sense. I think you'll find different translations do it differently. The place concerning the bush, and we have burning bush, the bush, burning bush. So you've got a decision to make there in translation. I kind of split the difference with putting that in brackets to show that the word burning is not in Greek, but that is the passage. I think that probably makes it a little bit more identifiable to your readers or listeners. Let's do verse 27, and then we'll leave the rest of the time for questions. And if we end a couple minutes before the hour, then that's fine too. So the kind of grand climax now of the passage, Jesus says, "Uk estin theas necron ala zonton, halu planaste." He is not God of the dead, but of the living. You are greatly mistaken or deceived. And we'll look at that verse a little bit. And there's a kind of theological and even a literary connection to make here. How do we move from I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? How does Jesus conclude from that he is not the God of the dead, but of the living? Because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are not alive at the time of this writing. And I think, again, the SIL Exegetical Summary Series is a great first place to go, where it will probably mention that. Yeah, that might be worth looking at. So in other words, the question is one of flow. How does Jesus move from Scripture to the conclusion he is not the God of the dead, but of the living? It's not explicit here, that thread. There's a little bit of connecting the reader is left to do. You might even check the parallel passages and see if there's anything there that gets filled out. Yeah, there may not be. So I think the commentators will give you more. Here you get some of the scribes answered, "Teacher, you have spoken well." That's in Luke. We don't have that here. But let's go back to this verse again, verse 27, just to wrap up. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are greatly mistaken. And so there's something about God, and I think this might connect to the power, that is inherently alive. And something in, this is a little interpretive, but something in the Sadducees' conception of God was like dead. I think there's something in that, and maybe specifically they didn't believe in the resurrection. And Jesus is making the connection to say the reason you don't believe in the resurrection is you don't believe in what your own scriptures say, and you don't believe in the power of God. In other words, this is not a lifeless God, but a life-giving, power-generating God. And you might even think about that in translation. This is very simple to translate in one sense, not the God of the dead, but of the living. But again, the meaning behind that is worth considering. Can I bring that out? And so I'm sure Eugene Peterson does something like this. He is not a lifeless, impotent God, but a powerful, living God. Let's see. I actually did not look at this verse before in Eugene Peterson. Let's see if I'm close. Oh, I wasn't even close. Yeah, he just sticks with living and dead. But I like this. You're way, way off base for badly mistaken. And that's the kind of part where we'll end today with this word study. Planaste is from planao. And if you triple click it and look at BDAG, you'll see You've got to cause to go astray from a specific way, or to proceed without a sense of proper direction, so oneself can go astray. And you've got here mislead, deceive, or be deceived. And they give it, they put this under be mistaken in one's judgment, deceive oneself. Now, all of these words are close cousins to each other. I do think there's some different nuance, especially between being mistaken and being deceived. If I say turn left on Main Street to get to the grocery store, and you know that I should have said turn right because you have to turn right, you might say you are mistaken. You have to turn right on Main Street to get to the grocery store. I may not be deceived at all. I may just be, factually wrong. There's something a little bit more morally present or at stake with the word deceived. So I think this is worth considering in your translation. And even then the question is, okay, if you translate this as deceived, the question is, are they deceived from somebody else? Are they deceived by themselves? What's the source of that deception? Which I think if it is translated, you are greatly deceived. I ask those questions. But I'm not sure that's where the focus of the passage is. I think it's less on how they got deceived and that they are deceived, and specifically that they are deceived or mistaken in these ways about the scriptures and about the power of God. Jesus is not doing an autopsy on their mistakenness, or he's doing an autopsy, but he's not doing a chronology, like how did it come about? He's just diagnosing their lack of intimate knowledge with the scriptures and the power of God. And he's setting them straight, and he's answering this question. He's answering the question he wants to answer about the resurrection. And in fact, he's answering their question too. But I don't know that he's talking about how they got to that place of wrong belief. So I find myself maybe wanting to explore this more, and maybe you do too. But again, as I said early in the passage, often what I'll do in a case like this is just offer a provisional translation for myself, which will probably be something like mistaken / wrong / deceived. And then I will try to make some headway on that. But here, because planao is used in both places, I would just want to make sure to use the same word in translation both times to bring that out. So if it's deceived in both places. If it's mistaken in both places. And you can check out your commentaries here. But this palu is also important. You're like way off. You're badly deceived. And again, I'm not sure that Mark and Jesus really want to tarry with how they got there, and more the fact that they are there and they're just totally off. So you might even go with Eugene Peterson, and Pillar does this too, and just say you're way off. And that actually is a very good translation, I think, of the Greek. And that even kind of lets alone that question of mistaken versus deception, which to me anyway raises more questions than it answers. And I'm just not sure which of those meanings is at stake here per se. So I would probably, if I revise this, maybe something like you're totally off, or you're so wrong. Wrong is another good word here. But that does kind of leave open the question of how they got there. But that's the end of the passage. We're going to pick up next time with the greatest commandment. So Jesus is still in Scripture, and he's going to really just kind of point people to what is the most important commandment. They ask him actually, but it's because some folks hear him debating, and they come up and continue to talk about Scripture. So that will be next time. I would be happy to take any questions that folks have. I'm going to also offer a discount code. So I'll just pull that up and put that in the chat. Actually, let me end the recording before I do that. So if you are watching on the recording, thank you so much for watching. Again, you can contact me at the email address on your screen, abramkj@accordancebible.com. And all the notes are at tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes.